Good morning, everyone. In business law, I thought I could put a quick summary review of Chapter 34, the management and dissolution of corporations. The chapter is very well written, but I guess it doesn't hurt to hear what I think are sort of the salient portions of the chapter. One of the things I think is interesting about corporations and corporate law and corporate management is that you can read about it and you can study it, but you don't really get to own it or understand it the same way until you are involved in it in some way, whether you're a shareholder in a corporation, whether it's closely held, which remember what closely held corporations were. These are small, often family owned corporations where there's not a lot of ownership outside of a family or a small group of individuals. And the stocks aren't publicly traded on an exchange like the New York Stock Exchange. Or you get involvement in a larger corporation. You buy some stock on a publicly traded forum, and you might want to go to find out how you can help or contribute to the control of that corporation, which we're going to find from this chapter is pretty de minimis, because as a shareholder, your real power is only in electing the board of directors, which hires management. And if you aren't a majority owner of the shares, 51% or over 50%, you may have a great deal of difficulty being simply an investor, having very much say in how that corporation is run whatsoever. The real privilege of it is you don't have any liability, and you made a decision based upon the prospectus of how well that business is performing to invest and hope to either earn dividends. Not all corporations pay dividends. Some are what we call growth corporations. You're investing in them because you hope you buy it at $10 and at some point it might be worth $15 or $20 and you sell and you make your capital gain profit. Capital gains are also in the form of dividends. Nice. But we're on the thing about management. How does a corporation get management? I go buy 10 shares of Nike. Do I get to go participate in how Nike's going to market and manufacture and make their shoes? Absolutely not. But what can I do with my 10 shares? I can vote for the board of directors at the annual meeting. And the bylaws will control a lot of this, meaning will a board of directors slate or candidate be on for 1 year, for 2 years, for multiple years? It's controlled by both state law, but it's also controlled by the actual articles of incorporation and the bylaws that the corporate charter had written up. So say they have 7 members of the board of directors. I can take my 10 shares, and usually it allows for what we call cumulative voting. I can take my 10 shares, which means I have 10 votes. I can vote, let's say 7 shares to make it easy. I have 7 shares. I can vote for one with all 7 of my shares, meaning say I know because I don't have that many shares, I'm going to have very little say in spreading out my votes over all 7 candidates or all 7 slots. So what I can do is cumulative voting. I can say, I really want to have a say, so I'm going to take all of my votes, which equals 7, and cast them for simply one individual that I think will really have a great impact on that board. That's called cumulative voting. That does give minority shareholders a greater degree of power, because maybe I can't get all 7 members on it or have a lot to say about them, but I might be able to work and get one individual on if I have a significant amount of shares vis-a-vis all the other members of the ownership um, entourage. Um, the others trust voting. You basically try to get together with other shareholders that aren't necessarily in the majority saying, hey, let's look for a slate of officers that will likely support our vision of how this corporation go. And then the trust will basically get proxies from us, our consent to vote, and we're not going to actually attend the meeting. If we attend the meeting, the proxy's lost and we have to vote it ourselves. But proxy voting is very, very big. And I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. What is proxy voting? The reality is especially in a larger corporation, there may be millions and millions of shareholders out there that own an interest in that company. And they can't go to the yearly meeting or the special meeting. Yearly meetings usually don't have to be given notice because it's in the bylaws when the yearly meetings will occur. But special meetings, notice does have to be sent out with the agenda for the special meeting. And a lot of members can't go. So what do? You still might want to have a say. You could give another friend who's a shareholder, or again, that trust that you identify with in terms of what the goals that they want to attain by voting for the board of directors, or an act that they want the corporation to do, an important decision, you can give a proxy vote. It's a very simple form. And what's interesting about it is you guys probably hear this, you're going to take the exam, you're going to forget about it. But when you're out there someday, either forming a corporation or being involved in a corporation or maybe even buying shares of stock, this will become much more tangible to you, and you'll get it's kind of common sense principles behind it. So what do the board of directors do? They often don't participate in the day-to-day running of the corporation. What they do is they are agents of the corporation. We went over agency law previously, so they have to act with a fiduciary good faith duty to promote the best interests of the corporation. And so they hire people like the president, the chief executive officer, and those people hire employees and other agents of the corporation to make it function well. They usually do not have liability for making a mistake unless the mistake is what we consider negligent. Like no reasonable board of directors would have made that kind of decision, or they acted in bad faith, self-interest, double dealing, intentional torts. They're going to be individually liable. But generally speaking, if the corporation says, we should move in this direction, we're going to go in this new line of clothing wear, say we're a sneaker manufacturer, now we're going to go in and do some hiking boots, and it turns out to be a complete failure and they lost money. Can a shareholder sue them? We can always sue. Are you going to be successful? No, because they're protected. And the book does not do a good job with this in terms of identifying the term. It's called the business judgment rule. And I had to study this a lot in law school, and I want you guys to know it. It's alluded to in the book quite well. But the business judgment rule protects the agents of the corporation when they make decisions that turn out to be, well, poor, as long as they were in good faith and they were designed to benefit and promote the health of the corporation. They were just, in hindsight, look like a bad move. So they're protected that way. So the stockholders meetings are usually yearly, unless there's special ones during the year. I've gone to a couple before. They're pretty fascinating and interesting. What's debated in the slate of officers up for the board of directors. In a bigger one, a bigger corporation, there might be a lot of competition for who's on the board of directors, but oftentimes the people that are running the day-to-day operation, the previous board of directors, will often offer candidates for a continuum of how they like to see the corporate board go in the future. In addition, many corporations do have lack of outside control, meaning that somebody or a group of individuals control 51% of the corporate interests, and they're going to control who the board of directors are. But they have to act in good faith. They can't do any self-dealing. They can't do anything detrimental to the shareholders' interest by design. And that's a good thing. It's a fiduciary obligation. What's a quorum? That's designed by both state laws. Sometimes the state laws say X number of shares have to be present either directly or by proxy. And it's not necessarily 51%. At one time, when some of the rules under state law would require 51%, it would often hamper the corporation from having the ability to conduct business, because having 51% to equal a quorum could be very, very difficult at times. So it's controlled by state law, but it's also controlled by the bylaws of the corporation. Is it 30%? Is it 60%? Do you want to make it a high majority so you don't have decisions not bought into by the membership, so to speak? So once the quorum is there, then a majority of the quorum usually controls the decision-making process. Now, you could put in certain decision-making processes that are very important to have a supermajority. Never, ever have it unanimous, because nothing will ever get done. And then the voting, again, I already talked about cumulative, trust voting, things like that, absentee voting. And a book does allude to it. It's always been interesting as a kid growing up a little bit and studying a little bit about business law, this concept of proxy wars. And there was one out here in Western Mass. I grew up, matter of fact, the law school is named after Presley Blake Law School out in Western New England Law School. Presley Blake was one of the brothers that formed the Friendly's Corporation, the big restaurants that are now either defunct or somewhat defunct. I think both brothers made it to 100 years old, and one is still alive. One recently passed, but they were out of the company for a long time. They sold it into different entities over time, but they still were the sort of the image of the Friendlies. Maybe they kept a few shares in the corporation that ultimately bought them, which what we call a merger or a consolidation. We'll get that in a minute. But anyways, the Friendlies went through some rocky times. Obviously, I don't know if it's in bankruptcy now, but during these rocky times, I remember driving through Western Mass where a lot of people owned shares of Friendlies, and maybe there was a significant number of shareholders, and there were billboards up advertising, saying, we're going to get a better board of directors. We're going to move in a new direction. We're going to, and with this new board of directors, we're going to hire new management, and please give your proxy votes to us. And so that can design proxy wars, because if you can solicit enough votes from people who are willing to give you their votes, it can be done. But proxy wars are very expensive. And who has the advantage? The current board of directors, because the current board of directors, it's not unethical for them to use corporate funds to go out and try to solicit proxy votes. So if you're an outsider or you own stock, but you're not a member of the current board of directors, and you want to go and advertise to all the outstanding shares that you want their votes to be used at an upcoming meeting, you're going to spend your own money. And I don't know about you, but I've been involved in political campaigns, for example, just sending out, unless you get a special bulk rate mailing, every letter is, half a buck, and not just to print, to type, and to mail. Think about that. If you're trying to reach millions of potential shareholders, you're pretty wealthy to be able to take that on, where the corporate board of directors can use corporate funds for it because they're exercising a business judgment to continue the continuum of their leadership on the board. So that's the voting process. Proxy wars don't come up too often. The rights of the stockholders. So what do you do? What do you have a right as? Stockholder has a right to receive a properly executed certificate. And obviously, if you buy it today, it might take a while to get the certificate, but you do have a right to get that certificate share of ownership. You have a right to attend corporate meetings and to vote unless it's denied. Why would it be denied? Remember, there are something called preferred shares. A percentage usually give up your right to vote at the shareholders meetings. You have a right to receive a proportionate share of the profits when profits are distributed. Profits aren't always distributed. Sometimes the corporate board thinks we need to reinvest, we need to grow, we need to do these other things. We're not going to issue a dividend at this time. As long as it's consistent with the business judgment rules in the realm of reason, you can't compel a dividend. And in addition, the stockholders are following the right to sell and transfer stocks. Careful though, if it's a closely held corporation, those can be limited to a certain percentage per year, and it doesn't necessarily go on the market rate. You might have to have a whole assessment of the value of the company to order it come. It's not traded in the open market, so that can be very difficult. But most publicly traded corporations are very easy. You just have to go on the trade stock market and sell. The right of the corporation issues a new stock. You have a right to the proportional share. So say I own 5% of some company, and the board of directors have decided, well, it's actually going to be done in an annual shareholders meeting, to expand and sell more shares of stock to raise more revenue to expand our company or to bolster a company's well-being financially. And they're going to offer so many new percentile shares. I'm entitled to buy a percentage of those shares as a subscriber to the amount. So I own 5%. I'm entitled to buy 5% of the new offerings. Otherwise, I'll lose the value of the percentage owner I have. I can reject. I don't have to buy, but I should be able to give the right of first refusal. That's where that term comes from, preemptive right. And the right to expect the corporate books. Be careful about that one. That's not an absolute right, because corporate books can be very complicated. It can be a whole building filled with corporate books. I'm exaggerating. It certainly can be a whole office. And they can be very, very cumbersome, and you have to have staff come out and pull them out and give you all the different records related to the functioning of the corporation. So you have a right to do it, but the right can be challenged, and you have to show good cause why you need to look at the books. So if there's some evidence of funny business going on or some kind of fraud, you probably will be able to prevail in a court if the corporation's trying to prevent you from inspecting their books. The board of directors, again, often a very lucrative job. They don't meet that often, but they're there to hire the best team to run that corporation. Their powers, again, it's usually dictated by the bylaws, will dictate what their powers are to board of directors. And the board of directors will have a list of what the corporation's purpose is for. They cannot enter into any contracts or goals that are outside that. We call that an ultra vires contract. So if we open up a corporation and the goal of a corporation is to run a law firm, for example, and all of a sudden somebody's opening up a pizza shop as the board of directors doing it, that contract would be void and the shareholders could sue, saying that the board of directors entered into an ultra vires contract. It's outside the scope of any reasonable connection to a law practice. But could buying a building be related? And I think that's one of the end of chapter questions. Yeah, because we needed offices and things like that. It could be related. Maybe buying cars for the employees could be a reasonable tangent. It's tangential. It's inherently promoting the nature of our corporation, even though it's on a tangent. And obviously, it's a judgment call. There's gray areas, and that's the term is ultra vires. Does it go beyond the scope and purpose of the corporation? If it does, it's null and void. We can always change the purpose of the corporation, but it has to be done what? The annual shareholders meeting with the consent of a majority in the quorum. Duties, good faith, fair dealing, no self-dealing. Then officers. You usually have to have at least 3 board of directors by state law. You can have more. You don't want it too cumbersome because decisions have to be made. But then there's officers. There's a president, vice president, treasurer, secretary. They're often all done by one person in a very small family corporation. But I think it's better to have separate those roles. But in a small corporation, there's no need to do that. Liabilities of directors, again, under Sarbanes-Oxley, that was a big one because a lot of major corporations went down because they weren't disclosing information. But the directors and officers of a corporation face a potential for personal liability for actions taken on behalf of the corporation, as well as taken for their own personal gain if it hurts the shareholders' outcome. They're only liable, again, for bad faith and negligence. That's pretty straightforward. And again, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, trying to enhance sort of public integrity in stock-bearing companies, requiring greater financial disclosure, and by putting the responsibility for disclosure on the chief economic officers and chief financial officers, as well as the attorneys that work for the corporation. So you can't keep it hidden. If you know things are going south or going poorly, you have to have disclosure to the shareholders. And if you don't, you'll bear personal responsibility, potentially criminal liability, because we don't want companies to hide the knowledge from people who are potentially going to invest in somebody that they're about to go freaking bankrupt. That's Sarbanes-Oxley. Corporation combinations. You should know the term difference between merger and consolidation. Merger is usually a larger corporation absorbs a smaller one. Consolidation, 2 companies decide to become one. Both previous companies get wiped out. A new entity exists as a result. Dissolution. Sometimes a corporation, like we had actually that was for the owning the building. Actually, we did dissolve that corporation too. We had a corporation, just the whole goal of the corporation wasn't publicly traded. We had a handful of shares for the members who owned basically a building. When we sold that building, the purpose of the corporation was no longer relevant, so we surrendered the charter to the state. Basically, we told them we no longer going to pay our yearly fees related to our charter. We're not going to file taxes anymore, and we're supposed to file annual reports. The state could have done it anyways if we just basically failed to file our annual reports and our annual tax returns, even though they're informational only because we were an S corp. There's no capital gains paid by the corporation directly. The state can do it also by bad conduct or illegality, but if you're not following the formal requirements of a corporation, the state can dissolve you. Abuse of the corporate charter, forfeiture, violation of state law. Maybe what you were doing before is now criminal. I don't know what that would be. Fraud in the procurement of the charter. You lied about something in the creation of the corporation, and therefore the corporation should be considered null and void as a result of that illegality. And sometimes failure to pay specific taxes for a specific number of years or file the return. That often gives you dissolution of the corporation. Pretty straightforward chapter. I always feel like I have to, or I should, participate in discussing what I think is important, those things. But I urge you guys, if you get into a corporation, just to invest and go see what it's like, go to an annual meeting. It's a very biased movie, but it's very interesting. It's called Roger and Me. Michael Moore, arguably, some could say a documentarian, but he's obviously doing it with a political slant, bought a couple of shares. I think it was in either Chrysler or in Chevrolet. And Roger was the president of the corporation, and he was closing down a lot of the Detroit plants and moving into Mexico. And Michael Moore wanted to go to the annual shareholders meeting to give him a hard time. And of course, they shut him down anyways. They stopped the mic when he came up and all that kind of stuff. Because the reality is, if you're not a majority shareholder, you have very little control over what that corporation is going to do. And Michael Moore, I think, taught us that in that video, but he made it look like the corporation was evil. Corporations are out to make money, and they are going to do what's in the best interest of the shareholders. And it's not about being always the most, patriotic or they're not out to save society unless they're a private corporation, or what we call a public corporation or nonprofit. Generally, corporations are out to make money legally, and that's the bottom line. I'll leave you with that thought. Otherwise, be well.